Welcome back, or welcome to the Rebel Tech Podcast. I'm your host today, David Dunmoyer, campaign director, of course, with Better Tech for Tomorrow at TBPF. Per usual, this is the show where we talk about all the promises and perils of emerging technology. And today, we're going to continue a discussion we've been having, not just on innovation and development in Texas, but some of the threats that we're seeing from hostile foreign nations, most specifically China and the CCP. And today I'm joined by an expert who I'm very excited to hear from him, kind of unpack his policy recommendations and really the fight he's been in. Michael Lucci, who's joining us here today. He serves as the CEO, chairman, and founder of State Armor, which we'll get into kind of the whole impetus behind that, what it is you're working on. But I have the highlight here is you created this to develop and enact state-based policy recommendations to counteract the growing threats that we're seeing from hostile foreign nations. So we were kind of joking about this beforehand almost, but I think by virtue of having you on the show, this is probably going to be down boosted. So we're going to do whatever we can to make sure we promote this content. But Michael, welcome to the show, and so happy to have you.
Thank you, David. It's great to be on. Great to work with Texas Policy again.
Yeah, great. Well, as I mentioned, State Armor, for folks who are listening and may not be familiar with the work that you do, I want to actually bring it back a second, because you have extensive experience in the state-based policy realm. In fact, you've even worked with the Texas Public Policy Foundation directly and indirectly in the past. You weren't always doing what you're doing now as an expert in securing Texas and other states from hostile nations. How did you find yourself as the expert you are today, and maybe talk about why you decided to kind of drop everything really and start State Armor?
Yeah, so I started State Armor because I saw a gap in the state policy world. Mm-hmm. For background, I've done tax, I've done regs, I've done labor policy at the state level, done a little bit at the federal level. I served as a policy head for Governor Bruce Rauner of Illinois. I had a minor role in the Trump administration. So I have a lot of state experience, a little federal experience. It was while I was serving in the Trump administration, and this was on a labor panel, so totally unrelated. But of course, I'm paying attention to what the national security team is doing, to what he's doing on trade policy, and I'm trying to understand it. And I'll give you one example. At that time, they started talking about moving federal pension dollars for federal retirees out of China. That's called the Thrift Savings Plan. They wanted to move that out of China. And so that was just one example where I thought, if the feds ought to move their pension dollars out of China, shouldn't the states? And actually, when you aggregate the states together, they have a lot more pension dollars because states employ a lot. States and locals employ a lot of people. They have a big public sector pensions. And so that was one example where I thought, well, if the federal government's going to go this way as it relates to a foreign adversary, shouldn't the states start to move in this direction? Now, what began as this idea of aligning states with national interest with federal policy direction has expanded greatly. What has become more clear, just become facts that I've learned, is that China specifically targets the states. Mm-hmm. They have a subnational strategy. President Biden's director of national intelligence laid out a memo on this 2 years ago. And they're not the first ones. Secretary Pompeo spoke to all governors in early 2020, where he told them, you might not care about the Communist Party, but they care about you. They don't just care about you, they're ranking you. Mm-hmm. And he explained how all those governors were being ranked by the CCP for ability to influence and infiltrate their offices. So that was kind of the beginning of, okay, wouldn't it make sense to align state policy with federal policy on pensions and other issues like that? It's since expanded into much broader areas and using state powers to just simply protect and secure the states.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think like anyone who is involved in the global policy landscape, and especially from a defense and resilience perspective, it's one policy item that then sends you on a rabbit hole through everything else. And I imagine we're going to talk through all that and more in the show. I think one of the avenues I first saw you, and my ears perked up and thought this is a guy we need to get in the show, was the House Select Committee hearing on securing Texas from hostile foreign organizations and nations, and chaired by Cole Hefner. There were some great members doing phenomenal work on this. You testified at the first hearing, and you really covered a lot of landscape, which is what the committee wants, is what are all the ways Texas can step up. So maybe we'll kind of truncate that testimony. What did you talk about? What have you been monitoring, and what's going on with Texas as it relates to these hostile threats?
The topic of that first hearing that we discussed was about land, the acquisition of land by hostile foreign orgs, let's just say the CCP, but there are others as well. And so we spoke about land, the importance of preventing adversaries from accessing land in all sorts of ways. To boil it down, when you have an adversary like the Communist Party of China that is targeting states, targeting military installations, targeting critical infrastructure, you want to reduce the surface area on which they can interact within the state of Texas. So you do that by saying they can't own land here, they can't own property within certain distances of certain assets, and you do things like Texas did in 2021, I believe, which was they said foreign adversaries cannot contract with critical infrastructure providers. Texas did that, and Texas is looking at the land issue because of one specific really shocking case of a retired general from the People's Liberation Army acquiring 130, 140,000 acres near Laughlin Air Force Base near the border with Mexico. And he says he wants to create wind farms there. And he did stand up some wind turbines. Texas, I think, rightly recognized this as the threat it was. We can't have generals from an adversary military plugging into the energy grid in Texas. And so they enacted that legislation. Now, he actually got some wind turbines up before that legislation took effect. So he does have control of some wind turbines down there, is my most recent understanding. But preventing that from going any further, and then looking at the land issue to keep them off Texas land, Texas surface area in general, we expanded and opened the scope of the conversation to the broad ways in which the CCP targets the states. We boil it down to three areas. So protecting critical infrastructure, land is a critical piece of that. Ensuring technological independence from the CCP. We don't want to be using their telecom equipment, their laser sensors, their connected vehicles, as we've seen recent federal action. And then, of course, shutting down influence operations, where we're working, very hard on topics on that across states. So those are the three buckets we discussed, and we discussed how China is specifically targeting the states because they consider the states to be the soft underbelly of American governance.
And I know, I think it was in a recent Oklahoma testimony I was watching you participated in, there's a rank order that China has in terms of states that are a threat or perhaps an opportunity for them. If you know, I'd be curious, how does Texas rank on that? Because our energy folks here are well aware that because of our independence in our grid and because Texas and the gigantism that is our state, of course, it's a great target for China. Do you know where Texas ranks in terms of China and how they see us?
Well, the primary category that they ranked is actually the governor's offices. And there's actually a more recent study by a professor at the University of Notre Dame, 10-year study of how the governor's office with their openness has been. We're going to compile that as a part of a publication.
Great.
I will say that the rankings of the governor's offices, it's in Chinese. And so I'm sure there's a translated version. I'm getting our team's translating it as well. I have a lot of confidence that Governor Abbott is in a good position.
Sure.
He has been very solid on these issues. In contrast, we had what was essentially a spy just rooted out of the New York governor's office, despite several warnings that was made to them. I think in the state of California as well, there's significant penetration, let's say. There are some red states as well with significant penetration by what I consider to be CCP agents. I do not consider the governing party and powers in Texas to be penetrated by these adversaries. I think that they've been quite good, and I think that they are aggressive and wanting to do more, and we're very happy to work with them to do more.
Amen. And it's sad, as a California refugee, I think the cleanest that San Francisco has ever been was when Newsom rolled out the red carpet for Xi Jinping making his visit to California. So I agree fully, and that's I know both our organizations are working with Governor Abbott's team to make sure we're continuing to do more and more. But look at the border. If the federal government's not helping Texas there, Abbott has had the most resolve of really any governor in this country on that.
And I think that example of California, of San Francisco that you just brought up, that's very illustrative of what's happening. And so Xi Jinping comes over this November of last year, And for the first time in how long, San Francisco figures out how to get the poop off its streets, basically.
Right.
And to get the homeless out of the main thoroughfares of commerce in San Francisco. And how did the Communist Party repay that favor? They beat in the streets the Chinese Americans who came out to protest.
Right.
And this has been documented well by a number of human rights groups in the United States. They've actually done some facial recognition of who was conducting that, tied them to various known Chinese United Front entities. And what that is, that's called transnational repression. And this is an area where I believe states are going to start making law very soon. This is when the long arm of the CCP or other foreign governments extends into our country and commits crimes such as, in that case, assault, harassment, stalking, commits crime on behalf of a foreign government. And that needs to be treated very differently. The example I always make, I just made this example in Oklahoma. Of course, there's the rivalry, Texas-Oklahoma. And unfortunately, but inevitably, whenever you have a college football rivalry, you'll have a couple, fights outside the game.
To be clear, we're recording this before the Red River rivalry, so whatever happens, hook 'em, but we'll see.
So that is, that's a normal case of a fight, of an assault.
Sure.
But when that type of assault would be, say, a communist Chinese national going after a Uyghur, a Hong Konger, a Taiwanese, that's a fundamental attack on rule of law in the United States. It needs to be treated differently. And so states ought to categorize what transnational repression is and begin going after it.
Yeah. No, I agreed fully. And it's I wish it wasn't comically sad how prescient, like South Park has been in almost predicting some of this too. That the state of California gets its act together for the Chinese Communist Party. And I did not realize they had successfully ID'd some of the folks involved in the beatings of American Chinese. It's tragic. It's beyond tragic, actually. And, you kind of talking about that's a direct physical infiltration. One thing I know we've both worked together on is the more software or tacit infiltration, TikTok, Temu, WeChat, other apps that the Chinese Communist Party are owning and operating. Can you talk for a second about how all those apps kind of fit into the broader strategy of what China's trying to do nationally in Texas, however you want to take it?
So with those applications, one, China wants to collect. So they're collecting all sorts of personal information on any user. Often those apps have access to even every keystroke that you make. Of course, an application like Temu is going to be aggregating all of your consumer habits, your purchase data, et cetera. TikTok's going to have access to, video conversation that you've made on your phone. So there's the collection, the surveillance. In the past, we've seen this used to track journalists within the United States because those journalists were meeting with TikTok employees and whistleblowers. And so there was kind of access to figure out who that was. I would say more recent court filings, very recent court filings, have TikTok essentially admitting that they don't control their own algorithm.
Right.
So who controls that algorithm? The parent company that's controlled by the Communist Party of China. And so there's kind of a two-way, think of this as kind of two-way telemetry. They are accessing data and pulling it back, and any data that becomes the property of a Chinese company becomes the property of the Chinese government. That's the 2017 National Intelligence Law. There are other laws that specify that as well. But it's two-way. They hoover up as much data as they can, so they could develop pattern of life and other types of information on you. And then they propagate really hideous propaganda. I recall Osama bin Laden being rehabilitated on TikTok about a year ago. Horrendous propaganda as it relates to our allies in Israel. Really racist and anti-Semitic tropes have been promoted even by direct Chinese officials on Twitter. And so what they want to do is sow division. They want to, with respect to Israel, they want to promote this, crazy Hamas terrorist narrative just to divide the United States and sway young Americans to be against really America's national interest.
Right. No, it's from a protecting children online perspective too. I know there's been the recent multi-state attorneys general joining forces suing TikTok, and in Texas, one of the bills that we worked on was the Securing Children Online Through Parental Empowerment, the SCOPE Act, and Attorney General Paxton just brought a suit against TikTok for blatant violation of protocols that give parents more control over their kids' online social media use. We're also seeing this, and you said it, the product that they're serving in the U.S. is very different in China, is it not? I mean, there's this study that kind of brings together the influence that social media can have on kids, and we know it's profound. We know that it's increasing anxiety, addiction, and so on. But do you want to talk for a second about some of the differences we're seeing between China and U.S. in terms of the products they might be serving their population versus us?
In China, it's science experiments.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., it's isn't Osama bin Laden a great guy? And let's try the blackout challenge, which has led to the death of a number of young Americans. In the U.S., it's the promulgation of really, divisive ideologies and suicidal ideation and things like this. It takes advantage of and exploits young Americans to that end. And this is perhaps why they don't want to turn over the algorithm subject to the divestment law that Congress passed, is because they don't want to see, the United States would see in code the digital fentanyl that the Communist Party tries to put onto our youth in the same way that they promote actual fentanyl to the same youth. I mean, actual fentanyl is the number one cause of death for military-age Americans. They're doing that intentionally. They're doing the TikTok intentionally. If you would see the algorithm, you would see in code what they intend to do to our youth.
Yeah. Well, taking it from TikTok, Temu, and all that, and to your point, there has been action nationally, and I know in Texas we saw, I think Texas is one of the first states to step up and say no TikTok on government devices and in universities. More to come on that next session. I know there's a couple of lawmakers looking at more to protect our information and also the kids' safety there. You talked earlier about one of the buckets at State Armor being critical infrastructure. And this has become a top priority for our organization as well. In fact, we're recording this today on the heels of the American Water Works, the largest water utility system, being infiltrated. We don't have all the details yet, but we're seeing critical infrastructure as a more lucrative, politically or otherwise, vector for China to infiltrate and wreak havoc. Do you want to talk about what are you guys looking at? What is the analysis from your perspective on cyber warfare and critical infrastructure?
Well, with respect to cyber warfare, I mean, they're certainly conducting upon us some of their, say, Volt Typhoon, which was unveiled earlier this year by the FBI, was specifically targeting critical infrastructure. We've actually had Flax Typhoon and Salt Typhoon in the last couple of weeks revealed collecting data, hacking into telecom. So critical infrastructure are those necessities for everyday life. Clean water, clear communications, things like this. China targets these sectors of the economy through what's called a civil-military fusion program. What that means is if there are technologies that have civilian use and military use, they want to dominate those technologies. They don't want America to be able to produce those technologies. Easy example of that, drones. States across the country are dependent on one Chinese company that's sanctioned for human rights abuses, and being a Chinese military company, that's almost a sole provider to most states.
And are these drones you can pick up at a Best Buy, or are these?
They are prolific across the United States, and unfortunately, we have a dependence there, and that dependence is intentionally engendered by their side. This is what civil-military fusion would be. If we would ever have a hot war with China, they want us to just not be able to build drones, and then they would swarm our side with drones that they could produce in mass. So that's something we're working out. But critical infrastructure, this is their ability, say, to shut down large power transformers, because those have been intercepted. A lot of those come from China, and there's equipment on there that shouldn't be there. This is their ability to shut down port cranes, such as in the Port of Houston. We have found ZPMG port cranes contain modems and internet connectivity devices that shouldn't be there. This is Huawei Telecom still being out in the grid everywhere, really. I mean, I think there's a rip and replace that's 5 years old. It's like 15% done Only the state of Nebraska has said all of it comes out immediately. The state of Nebraska did that because they discovered that the actual nuclear missile silos in western Nebraska were surrounded by Huawei Telecom. FBI says they're probably able to intercept those nuclear signals. So Nebraska says all of it come out. I think states minimally should say we want to know where it is to their telecom providers. Laser sensor devices that go in cars, go on critical infrastructure, just strip out all of their hardware, all of their software from anything critical infrastructure because they are actively looking to subvert, say, water. Jake Sullivan sent a letter to every governor in March saying, hey, they're coming for your water. Here's China doing it. Here's Iran doing it. They want to do it because they could sow mass chaos at a low cost. So looking through, perhaps even creating a registry of critical infrastructure in the state of Texas. What's most important? How do we protect that? And so on. We have a number of policies that would get at that, maybe first and foremost of which is what we call the Pacific Conflict Stress Test.
Yeah. Well, in one thing I know you've talked about, and my colleague Chuck DeVore talks about ad nauseum too, is pre-positioning. And so you're mentioning there have been direct attacks. Muleshoe, Texas was hit by cyber terrorists, their water system, old smart floor. There are instances we can point to, right? But part of this is we don't always know when China has infiltrated the systems. I'm thinking, you mentioned Salt Typhoon. If I'm not mistaken, they took credit for the attack on critical communications infrastructure. And they were in the systems for months before their notice, were they not?
Sometimes years.
Yeah.
Sometimes years, yeah.
So how does the pre-position, can you explain what that is and how does that fit into the broader strategy of China's digital warfare?
Sure. So if you think of infrastructure as bridges, physical bridges, what Congressman Mike Gallagher said is this is the equivalent of placing bombs on the bridge. You're not blowing it up now. You're reserving the right to blow it up later. So why would they do this? If there's a conflict between the United States and China, they would want to reserve the right to shut down all these things. So what we've noticed, and what I mean by that is the FBI, when China used to do hacking, when they used to place malware, it would have two-way telemetry. That means data would go in, data would come out. And what they are specifically wanting to do is to extract data for economic means, as a part of the largest intellectual property theft in the history of the world. They want to extract data for jet planes or other intellectual property. What the FBI has been describing is they're now seeing more one-way telemetry. Some nasty piece of code or virus is put on some device and it's just supposed to sit there. It's not providing data. It's just sitting there as a trigger or a bomb that could be detonated later. And so that is a change in the nature of the threat from an economic threat to a more direct sabotage threat that would be used in the instance of conflict, really. So that's what they're seeing on water. They're seeing it on telecom. They're seeing it on power grids and other port cranes, other things like this.
So obviously we don't know, and this is part of why, whether it's an inventory of critical infrastructure, audits in our system, and in policy that Texas is poised to lead on, how many bombs do you think are planted throughout Texas by China? Do we have any sense?
I really couldn't answer that question. I think that the FBI is working some on this. CISA, the cybersecurity agency, is working some on this. I think actually Texas has an opportunity to leverage its own cyber force, which exists in the military here, to start deploying threat hunters onto assets within Texas. If they're not already doing this, this is one option to consider. It is great that they have a cyber force because if some 0 day comes where China is trying to shut everything down, you want to be able to deploy people to help put things back together. Now, maybe those people would get nationalized, and that simply means that they're good enough that the federal government thinks that they need to be deployed to critical areas. But between now and a potential 0 day, I think that they ought to be doing threat hunting to the extent that they can, searching on critical infrastructure, searching on other critical assets in the state of Texas, finding malware, knocking it off. And perhaps there's really an opportunity for Texas to be the national leader because Texas has really incredible universities. This seems like something that if Texas A&M isn't already doing it, they could be training up these threat hunters, which have an incredibly lucrative skill set aside from protecting the state. These are people who can code. These are people who understand industrial controls, and these are people who understand security. That's an incredible skill stack, and it's a really patriotic skill stack that I think a lot of young Texans would develop for the good of their own career, but also for the good of their state and their country.
That's a phenomenal point that I don't think it's expressed enough. And when we're looking at policy recommendations for cyber, one of them is career technical education, or making sure, whether it's school choice, yes, TBPF product, we're talking about school choice, but seriously, all the educational outlets to make sure we are training a skilled workforce, and IT, OT jobs are at the top of the list for what we need. And I know we have all these RSOC programs that have been set up throughout the state. UTSA has been a leading authority too on cybersecurity programs. Maybe we talked about this, and my colleague Zach Whiting and I, we had a cybersecurity episode. Can you talk for a second about kind of the disconnect between physical warfare, meaning bombs being dropped along the eastern coast, and digital warfare, just in terms of how can we as a country, or for listeners, maybe better conceptualize the threats of cyber warfare? Because if we don't see it or feel it, it's out of sight, out of mind. Any words to the wise on that?
Well, it's certainly a component of economic warfare, so theft. The greatest theft in intellectual property has been China stealing property from the United States, and they've militarized much of that intellectual property. We have kind of graciously opened ourselves to them, invested in China, and invested in their industry, and that has allowed them to develop. But they've also just developed through theft of American intellectual property, whether it's directly military or dual use or otherwise. So there's that piece of warfare. There's the piece of warfare where, say, the United States would do the same thing. If we were staging to go into a place like Iraq, we're going to knock out their communications. We're going to knock out other critical abilities that they have so that they're less able to counter us. So China would do the same thing. They almost certainly know our most critical ports and thoroughfares for military resupply to the Pacific. They have certainly prepositioned ways to try to knock those things out. And so this would be how you weaken America's ability to project power. But furthermore, this is, let's say they were to go for Taiwan, and they would tell the United States government, we recommend that you look up all the costs and benefits of defending Taiwan, and we'd like to share with you some of the costs. We will knock out this, 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 and this if you come defend Taiwan. You've got over $1 trillion of physical capital in China. It's going to go away. Unfortunately, we have still over $1 trillion of financial capital, including through state pensions tied up in China. We could fix that problem quickly, but until we fix that, they could take that away. So they have all these ways where they could say, look at the balance sheet and look at the costs of defending Taiwan if we were to choose to do that. So we need to remove all that surface area. We need to remove all those essentially hostages that they're able to hold before they would move on a 0 day.
Yeah. I want to follow up so desperately on the economic almost fealty that we have. Just so you can say it one more time, how much are we in the red to China when it comes to pensions? You said $1 trillion?
So the United States capital markets have deployed probably between $1 and $2 trillion. A gentleman named Roger Robinson, who served on Reagan's National Security Council, put together that estimate. Tens or hundreds of billions through state and local pensions. And there is a wave beginning to divest. There's no way you can't hold these assets. I mean, how do you hold Chinese assets and fulfill your fiduciary duty? We're presenting that argument to fiduciaries actively right now, and I expect them to begin acting on that. That's a new study that we put together with really some incredible legal experts, and so we hope to move on that soon.
Now I wonder what the ESG score of investments in China is for some of these firms that are kowtowing to the woke left.
Unbelievably, somehow these Chinese firms, where you don't know what the heck is going on with them. They don't have any data transparency. They chase American auditors out of the country. Their ESG scores somehow line up with a normal U.S. mid-cap company.
Amazing. Yeah.
So you would actually think that this is somewhere where the ESG and everybody else can come together and say, we don't think that this is very good. ESG actually has not come through for us on giving Chinese companies the grading they deserve.
Yeah, well, social governance as it relates to Uyghurs, I guess, is not a priority for some of these firms. That's macabre.
And anyone who's managing assets and putting Chinese assets in their funds ought to be disclosing that.
Right.
If two consecutive State Departments have concluded there's genocide occurring in that area, that ought to be in a disclosure. Yeah. There's all sorts of other things that ought to be in disclosure, and I would suspect that you'll rarely find honest disclosures being made by fund managers who are putting Chinese assets into Texas pensions, Texas private sector savings accounts.
That's a great point, and I think for anyone clipping this, that's another policy recommendation that can be pursued. I want to bring it back. You earlier mentioned the three buckets that you're really focused on, and one of them is independence technologically, or more so making sure we're not dependent upon Chinese technology. Maybe we can take this specifically, but I'll just give you, cut an advertisement. What does that bucket look like for you all? What are you currently looking at with Chinese technology dependence?
So certainly computers, certainly drones, certainly internet routers. I believe there's a Chinese affiliated firm that has about 20% of the router market in the United States. I suspect that they're probably in state government, local government use, critical infrastructure provider use. The risk there is that you're simply providing a backdoor to access all of your connected devices and technologies. Credit to President Biden for taking a first move, but I think states ought to move further on connected vehicle technology. So it does look like President Biden wants to, block this altogether from the United States. We were all rightly worked up about that balloon that flew over the country a couple years ago. Imagine you have a connected vehicle with LiDAR sensors. So these are laser sensors that could measure every little thing in this room down to the micrometer. And these are just flowing around the streets of Austin nonstop. These are flowing around our critical infrastructure nonstop. They would map out in extensive three-dimensional detail everything anywhere in the United States. That's an unbelievable security threat. So there are things that states can do to block that. Certainly don't buy their cars, but I don't think they should be allowed to. I don't think you should be allowed to register a car if it has this spyware technology.
Just to underscore this, is there incontrovertible evidence to suggest that there is Chinese LiDAR technology in certain autonomous vehicles that were operating around Austin?
So there's a company called Hesai, and I believe they have contracts in Texas for it's perhaps trucking or some other. Hesai actually makes public disclosures. When they IPO'd in the United States, they raised capital in the United States. In their disclosures, it said the Chinese government can take control of all this at any time. Which is, of course, what their laws say in China. So imagine that. So imagine you have what might be called an over-the-air software update. These laser sensors, the ways that these cars talk to each other, maybe it says 40 feet is a safe distance. Imagine there's an over-the-air software update that says it's not 40 feet, it's 4 centimeters. That's a safe distance between cars. To give them that capability would be an incredible error. And so I know that there are such LiDAR devices in bridges in Florida, so literally on bridges in Florida. I suspect that there are some in automobiles, trucks, and otherwise. They're beginning to be introduced in Texas and other states.
See, and that's we have a research paper on autonomous vehicles, and kind of after we talked about this, there's always rabbit holes once you start on China. I went down one on autonomous vehicles, and Hesai, I remember that name, and Zoox is a company operating in Austin, and they were at some point partnered with Hesai. I haven't seen any recent documentation, but also GM's Cruise, which was one of the number one operators in Austin before tragedy ensued in California and they ceased operations. That is something that, to your point, we will commend the Biden administration for taking action on that, because it is a huge, huge problem. And, you've done research. It's not just LiDAR. It's some of the other technology in vehicles that's of concern. Anything else that Texas lawmakers are could look at in the automobile space, or I'll leave it there for now.
I think in the name of state security, there should not be cars registered for use in the state of Texas that contain spyware. So that's LiDAR, internet connectivity devices, anything Bluetooth enabled that is a PRC technology. I think that what's unfortunate about this issue is that it is the American auto manufacturers that fight hardest in state houses to resist this. Now, I think that there's now cover from the Biden administration, and I believe that President Trump would have done the same thing, to say this stuff cannot be going around our road. I think American auto manufacturers need to get the message. They've been very slow in getting this message that it is not their job to help the PRC spy upon every American street. It's their job to make money in compliance with American national security. It's very important they start to get that message. I had more fights with auto manufacturers across state houses this year than with anybody else.
Wow. Yeah. And we recently had, there's another House Select Committee on AI and emerging technology. There's a gentleman who testified about the data privacy threats with really any vehicle that's built. I think it was after 2007 or 8. And so you take some of the LiDAR, CCP owned and operated technologies with the vehicles that we have that are now computers on wheels, and it's the entire surrounding area of the car that's being surveyed, so critical infrastructure threats, but then also the personal privacy of the driver. And
pattern of life.
That's right. And my colleague and I, we always talk about, Matthew Crawford has a book, Why We Drive, Philosophy on the Open Road. For anyone listening, highly recommend the book. But one of the policy recommendations he posits is, are we getting to a point where we need to have a right to drive? And if the CCP, their technology is pushing us toward autonomy, no steering wheels and brakes, they literally control our transportation networks. So I know this is something we're fully aligned with you in terms of there needing to be action. To shift from the automobile sector for a second, ports have been a big point of ire with the recent strikes that are happening. A lot of that was around automation. And I know you've looked into, and there were some recent congressional reports too, on Chinese control over a lot of the devices we're using at ports. Do you want to talk about maybe the threats there and what, if there's policy recommendations, what we can do?
Get all their devices off of port cranes. So they are the primary provider of ship-to-shore port cranes. So you take a box off a ship, you put it on shore, and vice versa. Okay. ZPMG is almost a sole provider, over 80% of ship-to-shore port cranes across the United States. This is why the United States Navy will not access most American ports, because think about that.
Okay.
The United States Navy doesn't want to go into most American ports because the CCP will spy on them. So these port cranes, they come in different ways. Sometimes they get put together by a Chinese crew. They often contain modems and other connectivity devices that ought not be there. So I would say in the short run, get their devices off. Presumably the steel is okay, but you don't want it running on any of their telecom devices, any of their software, because that's where the remote access comes in. Actually, that software provider, if it's a PRC software provider, they're legally bound to give the Chinese government that access and that control. So get their stuff off. President Biden's done an executive order to get rid of those port cranes entirely, but this is a 5-year phase-in. Hopefully Taiwan's not been invaded 5 years from now. So in the meantime, get their stuff off there. There's also a Chinese company that is a partial owner of some of the operations firms in the Port of Houston. I would look at that. That was highlighted in the Select Committee's report. Perhaps there's a state solution on that issue. I haven't done a full dive on that. We don't want them anywhere near our ports.
And ports are something, I'm thinking of the movie The Irishman, and there's that scene where Hoffa, who's the head of the union, the trucking association, is talking about how Americans don't realize how important the trucking industry is until we go on strike and nothing's working. Well, we witnessed that recently with ports. How, for our listeners who may not be as aware, how crucial is it that we have sovereignty over our ports? Like, what's the economic and political consequence if China owns our ports, so to speak?
How do you resupply the Navy, Marines, or Army Air Force in the Pacific if you can't control your own ports? So China could go to war with us, start hitting us in the first island chain, which is Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and our sailors, Marines, airmen, and otherwise would have the equipment that they are left with at that time. Because if we can't control our ports, how are we going to resupply them? Now, through fits and starts, I'm sure we could get stuff over there, but is that the plan? Through fits and starts, we could resupply our fighters when they face the greatest adversary we've ever faced as a country. To allow them to know everything going in and out of our ports, which is probably what's happening right now. It's insane. Yeah. I mean, the variety of ways that they could use that data, knowing patterns of food, supply, medicines that are going in and out of our ports. that borders on national suicide if we don't fix that problem. Now, I think we are fixing that problem. I think that states can do more to help push that, but this is how we physically move between the United States and the world. It's ports and it's airports. To let them control that, until Elon Musk has rockets ready to go between here and there, which someday that might happen. This is how we're going to get stuff to our soldiers.
No, it's well said, and it's one of those things where at least we're seeing more and more transparency around this, and I think it's emerging as an important issue. I normally don't end podcast episodes this way, but this is a tough subject, and I think it's one I know you have devoted a lot of time and a lot of personal capital to this mission that you're working on. There's a lot of grim stuff happening. What are you optimistic about? We're in Texas and we're 2 blocks down from the Capitol right now. I know there's a lot of great work that's happening in the interim, but maybe for our listeners, what are some things that you're optimistic about heading into next session, or just broadly in your work, something that gives you encouragement that we're gonna fight back?
The United States has the most incredible set of allies in world history. Now, we don't always love everything they do, but we have an incredible set of allies. Furthermore, practically no one in the world wants to live under the governance of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people themselves don't particularly like it. The Chinese people in China are the first and greatest victims of the Communist Party. Unfortunately, the Chinese people in America are becoming victims of that same Communist Party through transnational repression. So in a moral sense, nobody wants the product they're selling. I think that we could discuss ways that the American product ought to be improved. Fully agree with that. First Amendment needs to be sacrosanct, things like that. But no one wants that product. Our mission is to make sure it's not foisted upon the world, foisted upon the United States through, aggression, coercion, military subterfuge, or otherwise. And so we need to root that out. With respect to the states, I'm very bullish because we have a magic power in the states. Whereas Xi Jinping describes the United Front, this is kind of their broad spy operations, as the first magic weapon he has. He considers the PLA, the military, the second weapon, and the CCP itself the third weapon. We have a magic power. It's called federalism. It's called building solutions from the bottom up when the feds aren't getting everything done. Or in the case of the states should have their own solutions anyways. The federal government doesn't need to and really shouldn't fix every little thing. And so this is a magic power, our sovereign states, our federalist system, and we can build solutions from the bottom up. Whereas the Communist Party has a strategy for the states, and one of their phrases is to use the local to surround the central. And what that means, think of the Chinese version of chess or checkers, where you kind of surround pieces on a board. They want to use the states and localities in that way to surround DC federal policymaking. That can be reversed quickly, and we can empower the states and work with the states to drive our policymaking in another direction. So that's what I'm very bullish on. They do not have an answer for that. If the states start standing up and saying, we've had enough of this, we've had enough of you targeting Asian Americans in our state, they can cry racism and all this nonsense that they say. They don't actually have an answer for that, because all they understand is centralized power top down. We can have bottom up solutions, and we could drive in another way. I think that you combine with strengthening allies with Europe and Asia. I'm bullish on the United States, but we do have to aggressively and quickly solve a lot of these problems. If Xi Jinping decides that he wants to take the world to war, that's a bad day for everyone. I mean, that's going to be, everyone's going to lose. And we need to be ready for that day. But short of that, I'm very bullish on our prospects in Texas, in other states, because we have magic powers to leverage against the CCP. They don't have a good way to counter these powers.
Amen. I could not have said it better myself. And to plug federalism and a state-based policy podcast, I think you just won. So, well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the Rebel Tech. And for folks listening, please do check out statearmor.org, their website. And I know They break down all the different policy areas they're focused on and a lot of the events and press that you often find yourself involved in, as well as we'll have a link down below to Michael's X, still want to call it Twitter, where I get a lot of my content from just to see what's happening at a state and national level on kind of the tech intersection of CCP. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and please keep up the good fight, sir.